A little better. You can hear that? All right. We are in business. We are in Exodus this morning, coming to a text which is one of the most famous defining moments for the history of God's people. Another flannel graph moment, as I like to call them. Moses is involved in events that will change the shape of human history based on his alleged conversation with a bush. So here we are. Exodus chapter 3. Just to remind you of what's been happening in this exciting life of Moses. Of course, we were saying he was born about 1527, a few years into the 18th dynasty of Egypt. He's fished out of the Nile River by the daughter of Pharaoh, as she's called, who we are hypothesizing could be Hatshepsut. That's never been proven for sure, but certainly an intriguing theory that many have pursued. So I'm simply following the thoughts that others have kind of trailblazed earlier. But if that's the case, it certainly explains some things. It explains Moses getting this extraordinary education that the New Testament affirms he has, and all of Jewish tradition affirms. He was trained in the very best of the educational opportunities that could be afforded at that time in history. However, the political winds changed direction, you recall, when he was about 40 years old. His adoptive mother, who would actually become the Pharaoh herself, one of those rare female pharaohs of ancient Egypt, is finding herself besieged, embattled by her stepson, Thutmose III. And the story is very obscure as to exactly what happened there. Nobody knows for sure how it is that Hatshepsut died. Some, of course, think she may have been assassinated by Thutmose or his minions. Some think she may have committed suicide because she just saw that there was no possible way she was going to escape the pressure that was being brought to bear. Thutmose was challenging her legitimacy as Pharaoh and claiming he was the true Pharaoh and that she had no place, so he was going to basically push the issue until it was resolved. And probably Hatshepsut realized that with the support of the military, she didn't have much of a chance. So in any event, she's gone. She dies in 1483, and this young, now grown-up military genius takes the throne of Egypt, who we know of as Thutmose III. Moses, of course, if he had been in the household of Pharaoh, would have realized that the jig is up as far as he's concerned. He's certainly not going to be the successor to the throne. He doesn't necessarily have to view this as life-threatening. He's not going to be executed right on the spot for his attachment to Hatshepsut, but it is forcing him to go to plan B. If he had thought originally that by becoming the Pharaoh, I can lift the burdens on my people, the Hebrews, he realized that wasn't going to fly, so maybe he thought he could join with them and maybe broker some kind of resolution of their difficulties, working on their behalf. He still had friends in high places. He still had some political capital that he could play at this point. And so that may have been what caused him to go out and find this attachment to his people. But of course, things go from bad to worse. He winds up murdering an Egyptian, realizes that he's more of a liability than an asset to his people, and probably for their benefit, he escapes then. And we were saying on the map here from last week, I'll just remind you, that he escapes across the Sinai right along here, probably using a very well-established trade route that brings him down to the northern tip of what's called the Gulf of Aqaba, and from there goes down into a region that in the ancient world was called Midian, and is part now of Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Arabian Peninsula, of course, comes way down, as if you know your map of this region. That's a huge peninsula, and that is Midian is kind of in the northwest part of that great peninsula. So that's where we left Moses a week ago. And in a week, 40 years have passed. So, my, how time flies, huh? Here we are now, 40 years later in the story. And we're going to pick this up then in Exodus chapter 3. So, we won't make it all through this chapter. We'll kind of see how. But this is such delicious material. You know, who could want to race through the burning bush story? We have to kind of savor this a little bit. So, we'll try to enjoy it while we're here. Let's take the first paragraph then. We're in Exodus chapter 3, beginning at verse 1. We'll read down to verse 6. This is the Word of God. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. So there's our initial text. Let's ask God's blessing on our consideration of it. Heavenly Father, we are grateful for this great moment, this turning point in human history when you confronted your servant Moses in a burning bush. We pray that as we seek to understand the events surrounding the life of Moses, that we would also recognize that sometimes you confront us in burning bushes. And we pray that you would help us have eyes to see and ears to hear those moments when you speak to us and call us into your service. We pray that you would help us to hear your voice better as we reflect on this incident, asking these things in the name of Christ. Amen. So, Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he came to a mountain called Horeb. Now, there's two little details here that already are somewhat intriguing. One is how come Moses' father-in-law has a different name? Did you catch that? In chapter 2 it was Reuel, and now in chapter 3 it's Jethro. What's up with that? And of course there's no explanation of it. It just is a change that takes place, and people have been somewhat intrigued by that, and it is a little bit confusing. There's several explanations. I'm going to give you the right one. Okay? So that's why you pay the big bucks to get in here, so you can, get the right answer. So anyway, this I think is by far the preferred explanation. It certainly makes the most sense to me, and I think you'll agree it probably is the most likely, explaining of this little change. First of all, the Hebrew word for father-in-law here is actually a much broader word than that, and it really stands in a kind of generic way for any in-law relationship. So it can be used much more fluidly than simply to refer to a father-in-law. It can refer to a brother-in-law. It can refer to an uncle who's an uncle by law, by marriage, or others, a cousin and so on. And it's frequently used in a variety of ways that would encompass all of those various in-law relationships. It's probable that Reuel has died. Remember, 40 years have gone by, and if Reuel was the original father-in-law of Moses, then it is probable that over 40 years he's gone. And this priestly responsibility has probably devolved to his son, or maybe to some other family member if Reuel didn't have any sons, but somebody was the successor and is probably a relation, and thus would fall within the broader ambit of the Hebrew term that's used here for father-in-law. The translators continue to use the conventional reference rather than confusing the issue, because you can't say for sure is this brother-in-law? Is it some other kind of relationship? So they continue to use that phrase. But in terms of the Hebrew, it could certainly allow for a different connection. So I'm going to assume that even though he's called the father-in-law, he's probably a brother-in-law, something like that, in terms of the family relationship. So his name is Jethro, and of course we'll run into him again at a later time as we proceed through Exodus. He's said to be the priest of Midian, apparently replacing then the earlier character known as Reuel. We read concerning Moses that he led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now this raises then the question, where is Horeb? Where is this mountain of God? We know one thing. We know that wherever this mountain is, it's the same mountain that Moses would return to sometime later with all of the people freshly liberated from Egypt. And so whatever this mountain is, it's going to be that location. The traditional site, which has been more or less accepted in many quarters down through history, is that it's right here, a place that's called Jabal Musa. And to this day, if you say to a travel agent, well, I want to go to Mount Sinai where Moses got the Ten Commandments, they will book you a flight to here, you see. And there's a nice little monastery there and a gift shop where you can buy some trinkets and stuff like that. It's very lovely. The problem with that, first of all, is what in the world is Moses doing with a flock of sheep all the way from Midian, a couple of 100 miles, around the north of the Gulf of Aqaba, down here into this very arid region where there's not a blade of grass anyway, So on the face of it, there's a bit of a problem as to how it is that this could be the mount where Moses actually originally met with God. I think it's also helpful to know that this view that the mount here at the base of Sinai is the mount that Moses, where Moses met God, is a Christian invention. It is not a Jewish idea. The Jewish tradition, Jewish rabbis have never, ever understood this to be where Moses met God. The first time we ever come across that theory is about the late 2nd century, and it's when some Christian monks were sort of wanting to go out into the wilderness and have that kind of isolated, ascetic life in the wilderness, and that just seemed like a perfect place to go, And it's called Sinai, and the place is called Mount Sinai, and it just all kind of came together, and they found a particular mountain there that looked like a good candidate and said, this must be it. And from that point on, that's been it. And to this day, in fact, you'll notice on this map, you have traditional Exodus route, and it takes you right down to that mount. Well, if we ask, what was the view of the Jewish scholars, people who didn't have any Christian vested interest in this, but simply were interested in trying to locate Mount Sinai, there's been a pretty common understanding and a sort of common sense understanding that Mount Sinai must be over here, more in the region of Midian. That makes a whole lot more sense because that's where Moses was herding sheep, for Pete's sake. And so you think it must have been in this region. Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian, teaches expressly Mount Sinai is in Midian. Philo, the Jewish philosopher who was famous in the 1st century, worked out of Alexandria, teaches explicitly Mount Sinai is in Midian. The Septuagint version of the Old Testament, translated about 250 BC by Jewish scholars working in Alexandria, simply renders Sinai in Midian. The Apostle Paul, in Galatians chapter 4, says, he makes a passing reference to Mount Sinai. You may remember the text. And he says it's Sinai in Arabia. Arabia was not the Sinai Peninsula. It was here. That's where Paul puts it. So all I'm saying is there's rather overwhelming evidence, in spite of this popular theory that Mount Sinai must be over here, more in the range of Midian. The History Channel, interestingly, did a special on this 2 or 3 years ago in which they tried to triangulate the location of Sinai, and they put it right in Midian to the north, just to the east of the Aqaba, the Gulf of Aqaba there, right about in this region. Allowing, nobody knows for sure, but they also agreed it can't be down here at the base of Sinai. It makes no sense. So that's my view. Now, you probably didn't roll out of bed this morning with that burning issue on your mind. Where is Mount Sinai? But sometimes you think about these things, it really didn't make much sense, did it? For Moses to be way over here herding sheep, and I think this is a better explanation of it. So, be that as it may, we're going to assume that Horeb is there, more or less in the region, probably to the north of what's called Midian there on that map. It's called here the Mountain of God. And the way the phrase is used implies that it was already a recognized place of worship. We don't know what exactly use was being made of it, but the very fact that it's called this as if that was already kind of an identification of the place implies that even before Moses was there, somehow or other it was recognized as some sort of holy place or place of worship. I can't say any more about it. We don't know any more about it, but at least that's an interesting aspect of it, that Moses seems to have known he was in some kind of place where religious truth or religious experience took place. All right, verse 2. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Just a couple of details here. First of all, this interesting reference to the angel of the Lord. And I think you know that as you survey the Old Testament, occasionally this character shows up who is simply called the angel of the Lord. No further identification is typically given, but this individual does seem to show up in rather strategic moments. He's not called an angel. He's not given a name like Michael or Gabriel or something like that. And so it has led people to think that this must be some unique expression of God's presence. The angel of the Lord shows up again when Joshua is just about to invade Canaan some years later after these events. And you recall the story. Joshua's out there, he's surveying the prospects, he's mustering his army, and all of a sudden he sees this character standing there. And Joshua, like a good soldier, says, "Hey, who are you, for us or against us?" Kind of thing. And the angel says, "Neither, but I'm here with the forces of God's army," or something like that. The angel of the Lord. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into the fiery furnace, and Nebuchadnezzar glances in there and sees a fourth character, and that seems to be an identification with the angel of the Lord, that idea. From a New Testament point of view, this has been commonly taken to be what's called a Christophany. That is a manifestation of Christ, second person of the Trinity, in the Old Testament. So a pre-incarnate expression of God's presence. God the Son showing up in advance of his birth in Bethlehem. I don't think anyone's ever proven that with absolute certainty, but certainly the evidence points strongly in that direction, partly because this angel of the Lord will accept worship and is often identified with God's very presence, as we have it here. Angels will disclaim worship, In the Bible, if you try to worship an angel, the angel says, "Stop that. I'm just a creature. Don't worship me." That's idolatry. But this one that's called the angel of the Lord will actually apparently accept worship, as we find at least strongly implied here. All of that has at least led, from a New Testament point of view, to a certain degree of confidence that that's who we're dealing with. That's the view I'm going to take, and so we'll make that assumption here. So there's this angel of the Lord, we would say the very presence of Christ, which is the presence of God, appearing to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, the bush was blazing, but it wasn't consumed. Moses is a well-educated man. He's undoubtedly a guy that kind of pays attention to his environment, And when things like this happen, I would expect he probably wants to take a look-see, you know. He has that kind of interest and sort of inquisitive concern about what's going on. Maybe this is a brush fire. They're not all that in common out there in that area, but something about this one seems a little different, and so he's intrigued by it, and we have the story unfolding. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush isn't burned up. Now, I don't want to push it too far, but it does seem to me the text is inviting us to at least think about the fact that we are surrounded by wondrous things. Wondrous things. And there is a proper place for wonder in the life of the Christian, in the life of Christian imagination. I mean, you know, C.S. Lewis, what a great gift he has been to subsequent Christian history just because of the wonder that he saw in life and the way that he could see in a wardrobe in an upper attic, you know, some great Narnia. I mean, you know, you just think about it. What do we allow our Christian imaginations to carry us along? I'm afraid I don't very well. I tend to be much too rigid and much too inside a little box. But Calvin says, we live in a glorious theater, screaming at us the glory of God day by day. Just open our eyes, and there it is. And I think maybe Moses had a little bit of that. And when he saw this strange phenomenon, he just couldn't help but take a closer look, and so off he goes. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. I have not mentioned this before, and I will rarely mention it again. But I'm sure some of you in this room are familiar with what's called the documentary hypothesis. If you're not, don't worry about it. Not a big deal. If you are, then you'll appreciate the little comment I'm going to make right now. This is one of the toughest verses for people committed to the documentary hypothesis to deal with, because it says there's various sources. JEPD is the traditional breakdown there. And the problem is, in this verse, you have two of those sources virtually on top of each other, side by side, almost in the same breath. Two different names for God, one supposedly from one from the other. It's a very difficult verse for the documentary hypothesis types to handle. They try to, but I'm just saying it's one of those places where it's a little bit sticky. And you see the problem. You've got God referred to with two different names. So the first one is Lord, small caps, and I think you know that whenever you're reading your English version of the Bible and you see the Lord in small caps like that, standing behind it is called the Tetragrammaton. These four letters in Hebrew that we usually pronounce Yahweh. And the derivative of that is the word Jehovah. And so we have that as a name for God, Yahweh. It's going to be the name par excellence after this conversation that Moses has with God at this point. But certainly the name had already been used. We find it in the book of Genesis. But at this point it's elevated more or less to a much higher status. It becomes the central, most holy way of referring to God. The other word that's used here is God, and that is the Hebrew word El in the plural. And that word is Elohim. So the Hebrew word El means God. The word Elohim literally means gods. But this is called the plural of intensity. So it's not so much saying that there's multiple gods, but it's taking the word God and elevating it to a higher level of emphasis. Something like you've heard of the royal we. You know, somebody in a great prestigious office, you ask them a question and their response is, well, we think that we should decline your request. Well, there's no we to it. It's one person speaking, but to sort of dignify the office, the plural is used. You've seen that. It's something like that in Hebrew, where Elohim is a plural word, but it's simply intensifying the reference to the one true God. Oddly enough, while it appears to be an argument for a plurality of gods, it actually is even a more powerful argument for the singularity of God in the Old Testament. But that's not real obvious to all people. Anyway, those two names are used. What's interesting is in this verse, the two names are used back to back, side by side. When the Lord saw that Moses turned aside, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. This is Moses commissioning. Prophets in the Old Testament are commissioned. Do you understand that? Little boys in the Jewish world didn't say, I want to grow up to be a prophet. Prophets had a hard time getting life insurance, as you've heard. Usually they'd grow up to want to be something else. Prophets had a rough time. And the reason people became prophets was not because they ran for public office or prayed hard or any such thing. God simply singled them out. And prophets, in order to have the authority of the prophet, to be able to legitimately say, "Thus saith the Lord," bing, 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 whatever the word might be, in order to say that and have the authority to say it, there must have been a commissioning. And generally the prophets will tell us of their commissioning. This would be the commissioning of Moses. Isaiah gives us in chapter 6 his commissioning. Who will I send? Isaiah says, "Here am I, send me." And God fills Isaiah's mouth with his words. Remember that? Touches his lips with the burning coal. Jeremiah in chapter 1. God says, "Jeremiah, you're going to be a prophet to the nations." Jeremiah says, "Here am I, send Isaiah." He's not so sure. He doesn't like the idea so much. I'm just a youth, He doesn't like to speak in public. He's concerned about the prospects, as rightly he could have been. Hosea gives us the account of his commissioning. Ezekiel, in several chapters, that whole thing about the wheel within the wheel and all of that is simply a discussion of his commissioning. So my point is, part of what makes this text so important is this is the point where God is commissioning Moses. He's calling him by name, Moses, Moses, and laying upon him this responsibility to be a prophet, and more than a prophet, you see, to be the great lawgiver of the people of God. And so this call to him personally has to be understood as really richly filled with that specific address to him. At the same time, we see throughout the Scriptures how God calls people by name. And generally there always is in it some deep sense of God's authority and his affection. Samuel, Samuel. Martha, Martha, Simon, Simon. Can you imagine your name? God calling you by name. And what a rich thing that is. He knows us by name. And this call to Moses, of course, life-changing for him. Moses says, "Here I am." Then he said, "Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." So Moses is told to take his shoes off. Probably in the history of the world, nobody got out of his shoes any faster than Moses did on that occasion. But why? Well, the explanation given here is the ground upon which you're standing is holy ground. And I think you know, because you're all good Presbyterians, that this word holy is really the fundamental descriptive adjective that is applied to God throughout the Scriptures. Now, I say that, even though it may be obvious to you, but let me put it this way, there are a whole lot of evangelical Christians running around out there who don't get that point, And you go up and ask them, well, if you were to say, what's the main thing that we could say about God? Probably 9 times out of 10 they'd say, oh, that's easy. The main thing we'd say about God is that God is love. Well, God is love. But if you ask the question of the Bible, if we could just personify the Bible here for a moment and say, okay, Bible, if we had to find the one word that at the very core of the heart of the character of God reflects what he is, what would that word be? And it is all over the place. Notice we call this book what? The Holy. Not the loving Bible, or the joyful. It's the Holy Bible. In this church, we have a special room. We call it the sanctuary. The word sanctuary, of course, means what? A holy place. If I were to say to you, I'm going to go visit the holy city this summer, you would think what? Las Vegas? We all know, don't we? It is so deeply embedded in a kind of, cultural psyche of the world that holiness is associated with this God. The central place of worship was called what? The loving of lovings? No. The Holy of Holies. And the more we have that in focus, the more we kind of get what worship is really about. Because holiness inspires in us a strange kind of emotion. The famous phrase that was coined a few years ago by Rudolf Otto in his classic work Das Heilige is the mysterium tremendum. And it's a strange mix of awe, of fear, of trembling, with fascination, and it puts us in that strange place of knowing that we are looking at one that is infinitely superior to us, and we have a feeling of wanting to flee and yet wanting to stay, and it's in the very heart of that confrontation with the holy that we get in touch with the heart of worship, Worship is probably way too comfortable for most of us. We are, as Amos said, at ease in Zion, a little too comfortable in the presence of the holy. But when the holy ever really shows up, really grips you, then you know, I am but dust. Or as the people of God would often say, we shall die, for we have seen the Lord. And I think a little bit of that gripped Moses here. Take your shoes off your feet. The ground upon which you are standing is holy ground. Why did he have to take off his shoes? Two answers. The wrong one and the right one. Well, they're both kind of right, but one answer that's been floated is that it's simply a mark of subservience. In the ancient world, masters wore shoes, slaves did not. And so to take off your shoes was to denominate yourself as a slave, I think that's probably in a broad sense okay, but it really misses the, I think, more the real hard issue here, and that is this. In the ancient world, invariably, if you were going to enter a temple, you would take off your shoes. You didn't wear shoes into the place of worship. You went in barefoot, And in a sense, whatever that symbolized, it was the idea that you realize you're in the presence of one who is worthy of being worshipped. I kind of like that myself. Wouldn't it be cool to go to church barefoot? I don't know, I could get into that. As long as the floor is warm, But anyway, that's probably it. It was probably, because this is holy ground, take off your shoes. It was to say to Moses, you are in a temple. It's out here in the wide open, but the very presence of God makes this a place of worship, makes it a temple. Then the speech continues. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. So this angel of the Lord is now, of course, elevated to the very presence of God, and that's part of why we think it must be, the very presence of God here expressing itself as this angel of the Lord. This reference, of course, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob ties us back to Genesis. First time we were together this fall, we talked about the two great covenants in the Old Testament, the covenant with Abraham, so-called Abrahamic covenant, and the covenant with Moses. Then there's four others that also are part of the story of the Old Testament, but those two are more or less preeminent. So this declaration that this is the God of Abraham is simply in our minds to make it clear that this is still one great unfolding story of redemption, and that what God is doing here is not the least bit inconsistent with what he's already done. This isn't some new and different de novo kind of change of direction, but this is the same great story unfolding, and God is simply making good on the promises that he had made earlier. The interesting little subtlety here, of course, I am the God of Abraham. Jesus, you'll recall, in the New Testament, picks up that little point in his discussion with the Sadducees. Remember that from last year? Sadducees came and told this ridiculous story about a guy that died and had 7 brothers, and each of them married his wife, and you remember that whole thing? And Jesus, of course, is responding to their naturalism. They didn't believe in a resurrection. They believed you die, that's the end of it. You go into oblivion. The only heaven you're only going to get is here. It's kind of their naturalistic outlook. And Jesus confronts them with that based on their own scriptures. They disbelieved all of the Old Testament canon except the first 5 books. That's all they accepted. So Jesus goes to the heart of their canon, one of the most important texts from their point of view in their very restricted canon, the story of the bush, and argues from that text, God is not the God of the dead, he's the God of the living. Remember that great text there. And if Abraham were dead, then it would say, I was the God of Abraham, I was the God of Jacob, and so on. But no, these are viewed as living beings, and God continues to be their God, and hence the present tense is appropriate. All right, let's take the next little paragraph. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I've heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings. And I've come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I've also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this very mountain. So Moses, the classic has-been, is thinking, there's got to be a mistake somewhere here. Who am I? The Lord said, I've observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I've heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings. You know, that is one of countless statements in the Scriptures that should give us such encouragement. I know their sufferings. He knows your suffering. Every one of us in the room is suffering. I can't tell that by looking. You all look fine, you know. But you don't have to scratch very deep in most of our lives to find there's somewhere where we are suffering. Isn't it true? And that's part of why we come to a place like this. Because we want to hear an assurance that the God of heaven and earth has a clue that we're going through some grief. And this is the place that we hear that assurance. You won't get it from TV very often. You won't get it from the media, most likely. But the word you will hear when you come to the place of worship is that God knows. And more than that, that this suffering that you're going through is actually something out of which God will bring good. And that should give us a whole lot of joy. God had allowed his people to sink into a horrific circumstance of slavery, and yet it was his design to allow that so that they could not only be liberated, but so that God could be glorified. So if you're in pain, then I think I can say to you with a high degree of confidence from this text, God is going to be glorified in that, and it's going to be for your good. So buck up. Yeah. Isn't that? So that's why I'm not a pastor, you know. When it comes to pastoral sentiment, I'm mentally impaired. You know, my bedside manner is horrible. So that's the best I can do for you in terms of your encouragement this morning. But that is really what God is saying to his people, is this is going to be the basis upon which I'm going to be glorified and you're going to be, gloriously delivered. I've heard the cry, on account of their taskmasters, indeed I know their sufferings. And I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land. When Dale Bruner was here some weeks back, I know many of you were there for his wonderful presentation, and you may recall that he was kind of diagramming a theology of the incarnation. And he drew a big V. Anybody remember that? Just about like that on the board. And he was making the point in that connection that this is the nature of God's redemptive act in Christ, and more than that throughout the Scriptures. It always begins with God coming down and meeting us where we are, stuck, and then bringing us to a better place. By far, most of the religions of the world view it differently. You've got to clean yourself up. You've got to get your act together. You've got to fix something, straighten something out, and then you'll be appropriate to meet God. How many times have I heard somebody say to me, well, as soon as I get my life fixed up, then I'm going to start going to church. No. You go to church to get your life fixed, to get it straightened out. It's the cart before the horse kind of problem. This is why we're here. You hear the old expression, the church is full of hypocrites. Yeah, I'm one of them, Exhibit A. What better place for hypocrites to be, than here, where they're exposed to the grace of God and have the rich effect of restoring integrity to lives that are fragmented and duplicitous. Well, if God were waiting for us to get rid of our hypocrisy, fix ourselves up, clean ourselves up, we'd be waiting forever. But no, God comes to us in the mire, the slavery, the unhappiness, the brokenness of our circumstance. And that's the great preposition that starts this off. I have come down to deliver them and to bring them up out of that land. I have come down to bring them up. God has come to you in whatever the circumstances are of your life, no matter how they may look or feel. He's come to the very precise point of your need, but he hasn't come just to leave you there, but he's come to bring you up to a better place. And isn't that the life? That's the biblical story of redemption, isn't it? God comes to us to take us to a better place. And our lives are that journey of following him as he takes us to a better place. The better place here is said to be a land flowing with milk and honey. In the ancient Near East, those two words stood for the two great products of the land. Milk stands for livestock, milk, which is the very fruit and essence of, the kind of the life of livestock and so on, stands for all the things that would come by. That means honey is the sweetest expression of an agrarian kind of life. So you've got livestock and you've got crops and you've got a land here which is conceived of as flowing with both of those richly. And in those days it was. The best evidence is that Canaan in those days was rich and fertile and not the kind of arid place that we sometimes conceive of it today. Then these people groups are ticked off, the Canaanites, the Hittites, and so on. I'm not going to talk about them. If you're curious about them, you can raise the question in the question period, but suffice it to say, they're just kind of, for the most part, tribal groups under sort of chieftains. They were somewhat Bedouin in most cases. There was no great organization. There was nothing like the United States of Canaan, where these were all tied together in some sort of overarching governmental structure or anything of the like. But we do know this about them, that they were given over to the most horrific forms of perverse worship. Child sacrifice, bloodshed, and just the most ghastly expressions of what is the very worst of, what passes for human worship was going on there. And that's part of what drives the invasion of Canaan. It's to clean this land up of that kind of sordid perversity. So we do know that about them. Besides that, we'll just leave it at that. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I've also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. God's heard this cry. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. So there's the call, there's the mandate, and Moses responds, I'm your man. I knew this day was going to come. I knew all that training I had way back then wasn't wasted. I did slip up a little bit, but finally you've seen the light, God, that I'm the guy to do this, But Moses said to God, who am I? This is for everybody in the room that feels like a has-been. I've felt that way. You ever felt that way? My best days are behind me. It's all over. I spent my wad. I blew my opportunities. Here I am. Ever felt that way? Anybody felt? Is it only me that's felt that way? Moses felt like a has-been. He had his big day. He had his opportunity. There was a time when he was a dashing guy, He was impressive. He could, just by his very presence, kind of influence people. His voice was strong. His muscles were well-toned, and nobody got in his way. And now, 40 years later, herding sheep, he's not the same guy. Loss of confidence. Probably has beat himself up quite a bit over the years. Feels like, if only, how many what-if games had he played? Well, what if I'd done this? What if I'd said that? What if? How much do you suppose time he had spent over the years thinking in those terms? And just assuming that God had forgotten about him. 40 years, basically, of silence from heaven. And now, all of a sudden, God shows up. And Moses, of course, has a crisis of confidence that I think we can all identify with. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? The Pharaoh who is now sitting on the Egyptian throne is Amenhotep II. This will be about the year 1450, 1449 maybe. Thutmose III has died, having made Egypt the most dominant power in the world at that time. That's commonly accepted by ancient historians, that at the end of the reign of Thutmose III, Egypt was the sole superpower of the world. You didn't have much going on in Babylon. The Hittites, who are off this map up above here, were certainly rising in power, but they were no match for the Egyptians. The Mitanni were also kind of off to the east. They were a threat, but not anything really significant. Egypt was the only game in town, really. They had stretched out their borders, and when Thutmose died, he handed to his son the most astonishing kind of empire you can imagine for the ancient world. And Amenhotep II was young, strong, athletic. I think I mentioned last week that the hieroglyphs we have of this guy celebrating his athleticism show him riding on a horse with a bow and arrow. This is kind of like the male Annie Oakley sort of deal, riding along, shooting targets, hitting the bullseye as he's in motion. That's the kind of guy he is. He's going to do everything his father did and more. He is so filled with confidence. He's the perfect personality to be the Pharaoh of the Exodus, a guy that just won't give up, And so in terms of human psychology, I think we've got a pretty good candidate here for the character that Moses confronts. And Moses knew all this. He knew that that was the new ruler of Egypt. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? God said, I will be with you. And there it is, friends. It's not how eloquent you are, how well educated, what your IQ is, your socioeconomic status, your professional achievement. All of that's fine, not to be disparaged or despised, but when it comes to doing God's work, the criterion for success is not any of that, but what? I will be with you. Jesus says, without me you can do nothing. And we always have to think about that. Every little service we provide in the church or anywhere else, we need to always be reminding ourselves the real horsepower behind anything we attempt is going to be that God is with us. Didn't matter that Moses was 80 years old, that he was a has-been, that he'd blown his opportunities. Didn't matter, because the real test was God would be with him. So, I will be with you. This will be a sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you've brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. This, of course, gives rise to an interesting theory about the Exodus, because if Sinai is in Midian, then there is one major body of water that becomes a candidate for the site of the Exodus, and that's this Gulf of Aqaba. It would make the Exodus event a vastly, vastly more dramatic affair than if it is some kind of ancient body of water back over in this region, which is the common view. I'm not going to argue at this point dogmatically either way, but when we get to that, we'll at least entertain some of the theories that have been associated with the route of the Exodus